Hello, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Network 2020's discussion about NATO and the impact of several key elections on where NATO might be headed. Thank you all for joining us today. I know we're in competition with the Olympics, so congratulations to our panelists for being a big draw outside of what's happening in Paris. For those who may be joining us for the first time, Network 2020 is a New York City-based nonprofit, and we provide access to leading thinkers and doers in international affairs for our audiences in New York and around the world. We're really aiming to create more nuanced conversations about global affairs. It is a great pleasure to introduce our panelists for today's talk. Our first panelist, who I am out of order, is, let's see, for the first time, we're welcoming Mathieu Droin, who is a visiting fellow in the Europe, Russia, and Eurasia program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where he focuses on transatlantic security and defense. And prior to joining CSIS, he served as the deputy head of the Strategic Ministry for Europe and Foreign Affairs, where he focused on NATO, EU common security, and defense policy and maritime security issues. So welcome the first time. And then we have welcoming back Rachel Rizzo, who is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center, where she researches European security, NATO, and the transatlantic relationship. And last but not least, we are also pleased to welcome back Shea, who is professor of strategy and security at the University of Exeter in the UK, and a member of the group of strategic advisors of the NATO Special Operations Forces Command at the Supreme Headquarters, Allied Powers Europe in Belgium. He was a member of the international staff at NATO for nearly 4 decades. So welcome back, Rachel and Jamie. Welcome, Matthew. It is a pleasure to have the three of you here today. So, Jamie, starting with you. This year marks the 75th anniversary of NATO, and that 2024 NATO Summit concluded just a few weeks ago. So what were some of the major takeaways from this summit, and what do the outcomes of the summit tell you about the state of NATO?
Well, Courtney, first of all, many thanks indeed to you, Network 2020, for inviting me back. It must mean that I was either so brilliant last time you expect a repeat performance, or so abysmal that you've taken pity on me and given me a second chance, as it were. But I'm delighted to obviously share the panel with Rachel again and with Mathieu. Well, I suppose from a NATO point of view, the good thing about the summit is that it all went off very smoothly. And despite the inevitable danger of a NATO summit, and I've lived through some of these myself, suddenly being overshadowed by a major catastrophe, a crisis, obviously the situation in Gaza was in my mind. Despite all of these things, NATO managed to sort of dominate the headlines, which of course is what summits are designed to do for the 2 days that it took place. The second thing I would say is that this was not, from a historian's perspective, one of those great summits that, live on in memory 50 years later. It wasn't like London in 1990 when the Cold War was coming to an end and NATO invited Gorbachev to visit NATO HQ, or a summit like Prague in 2002, which launched big rounds of enlargement. It was more of a kind of get down to business, nuts and bolts kind of summit, not change the policy, not send NATO off in a big new direction, but sort of, put some of the flesh on the bones. Implementation, I think, is the key word here, of things that NATO had decided previously in Madrid and last year in Vilnius. I mean, there were 4 things very briefly, because you have to be brief. Number one, of course, Ukraine, the 3rd summit in a row with Zelensky present, where the war in Ukraine was the number one issue. Number 2, of course, enhancing NATO's collective defense, that program of boosting NATO's forces in Central and Eastern Europe that began in 2014 after Russia annexed Crimea, the whole issue of, defense spending targets and where they should be. Number 3, the rapprochement between the Atlantic theater, the Asia Pacific theater, with again another summit with the 4 leaders of the partners in Australia, Japan, New Zealand, and South Korea. And then finally, China. I'll probably focus, Courtney, because my time is limited, of course, in this introductory question, on the first two, because I know that Rachel and Mathieu will come in also very much on the second two. I think on Ukraine, it went well. I mean, in Vilnius, we had a very disappointed President Zelensky who was expecting something much more substantial on membership, a date, a roadmap, and he didn't get them, and it looked like a rebuff. This time round, Zelensky decided to look at the glass as half full rather than half empty. That's always helpful for a successful summit. He had been told in advance, particularly by the Biden administration, that this was not a summit which would set a date. The allies are not ready to do that yet. They still think the Ukraine has to meet some conditions, including corruption and reform of the judiciary, not just military issues. But also, last year Zelensky, I think, still was fairly hopeful that the Ukrainian summer offensive would work, and that therefore, we would be getting towards the end of the war and we could talk about NATO membership. Clearly, the mood is much more sober this time round with the Russians on the offensive. So I think what Zelensky was really focused on was getting a lot of things, in his rucksack to take back in terms of money, in terms of weapons. And I think, there was a lot here. In fact, Courtney, I took about 4 pages of notes, with all of the different things, Patriots, F-16s arriving soon, more F-16s being committed by countries like Norway as well. 23 countries are signing up hitherto for these bilateral security agreements with Ukraine, totaling $35 billion if they are all implemented. More repairs and training, spare parts for Leopard tanks. On it goes. And of course, if you look at the situation Ukraine is in at the moment with the Russian nightly, drone and missile bombardments, the rather parlous situation, frankly, that Ukraine is facing at the moment, particularly in the Donbass region. Getting the weapons quickly to Ukraine was the case in point. I think the second thing that probably Zelensky will be pleased about was the fact that NATO finally, belatedly in my view, I don't know what Mathieu and Rachel will think of this, but NATO stepped up to the plate in putting itself as the central organization, using the American base at Wiesbaden in Germany to start coordinating the training, the supply of equipment, albeit, under the tutelage of this Ukraine contact group chaired by US Secretary of Defense Austin, which will remain in place. Big question, once this gets underway in September, is it going to make a difference? We'll bring in NATO into the kind of central coordinating role, really, get things going faster, in greater quantity. Will the training keep pace with the delivery of the equipment? Will NATO be able to get 500,000 Ukrainian troops trained up quickly and into the front line? We will see. But I think at least it's a positive step forward. Then, of course, there was this agreement, that Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, had been pushing for NATO to also commit to providing 40 billion of euros, 44 billion dollars of financial aid next year for weapons, pretty much simply confirming that previous levels of funding support will continue. So all in all, I thought that wasn't such a bad result for Zelensky, given obviously what the most urgent needs are. The second issue, NATO's collective defense, there wasn't really any big headlines here, Courtney. We didn't learn about new divisions being set up in the Baltic states or whatever. But again, it was a summit of detail. It was a summit of nuts and bolts. And if you a NATO geek, as we say, or an anorak, to use a British expression, the Canadians, developing more submarines for the Arctic, Finland, the US, Canada working on icebreakers, the coming into operation of the NATO-based ballistic missile defense system in Poland. There was a ton of industrial initiatives where usefully, particularly if we think of Donald Trump, European companies and American companies were getting together to form consortia, to develop capabilities. The success, I think, was in this massive of detail. The one big headline was NATO, or the US announcing that it will deploy in Germany in 2026 Tomahawk cruise missiles. Takes me back to my days of the INF Treaty and cruise and Pershing in the 1980s a little bit, but also hypersonic weapons, SM-6 interceptor interceptors to boost up NATO's ability to hold Russian targets at risk and reinforce deterrence. And that predictably got a very sharp reaction from the Russians as well. And then moving to the Asia Pacific, as I say, I'll be brief there, but I think there was a pretty substantive meeting of the various leaders that showed that, both theaters are increasingly aware of the impact of one theater on the other. Putin giving missile and space assistance to North Korea in exchange for weapons against Ukraine doesn't help us in Europe, but it doesn't help Japan or South Korea either if North Korea suddenly increases its capability. So there was a lot of this sort of coming together, and again, various things happening. And then finally, I'm sure we're going to talk about this in great length, or not back length, particularly if I use up all the time in answering this first question. But of course, pointing the finger at China very forthrightly. The gloves were off for the assistance that it's giving to the Russians over Ukraine. Decisive enabler was the language used. And again, predictably, this brought out a very, very sharp reaction from the Chinese, which the alliance is going to have to think how it manages going forward after Washington. So again, not a summit to go down in the history books, but if you feel that, alliances also have to do what they say and occasionally implement stuff and not just come up with new announcements and initiatives, a worthwhile meeting to mark the 75th anniversary. I stop.
Thank you very much, Jamie. Rachel, there has been an increasing trend in the US of wanting Europe to take on a bigger role in NATO and continental security. And you recently wrote an article for Defense One recommending Europeanizing NATO. Could you describe this trend and how would it work? And how does that factor into the current state of transatlantic relations?
Absolutely. And just to echo Jamie's introduction, thank you to you, Courtney, and your team and Network 2020 for hosting this important conversation and for including me in it. So the Europeanization of NATO has always been sort of a touchy topic because there's this assumption that goes along with it that means that the United States will play less of a role in European security. And there's this I think, unfair characterization that says that the Europeanization of NATO is sort of attuned to the United States abandoning its European allies and abandoning its NATO commitments. And so I want to be clear that the piece that I wrote on Europeanizing NATO is not advocating for the United States to renege on its security agreements with NATO or to be less of a foundational ally of the NATO alliance. But so to kind of go back a little bit, when you look at the platform that Biden ran on, both during his campaign and during his presidency, it's been this message that America is back, that the mercurial nature of the 4 years of Trump's presidency is in the past, and our allies and partners abroad, particularly in Europe, can now breathe a sigh of relief. And what came along with that message was that the United States was going to continue this rebalance to the Indo-Pacific region, and they wanted to park Russia and put guardrails around the relationship and make it, quote, more stable and more predictable. That obviously did not happen. So what that meant was that the Europeans then had to deal with this situation where America was back, but also so was Russia. Europe had returned, or war had returned to the European continent in a way that it hadn't in decades, which left the Europeans, I think, in a situation that made them realize they really needed to double down on more defense spending, on a more integrated defense industrial base, and at the end of the day, just a stronger ability to protect themselves in the face of Russian aggression. Europe needs to do more, I think, is the message there. That's been difficult in the United States. So this idea of a European pillar of NATO or Europeanizing NATO has been around for decades, and it hasn't gone down well in the US for many reasons that I mentioned before. But I remember, well, I don't remember because I was like 11 years old, but back in 1998, when the Saint Malo Declaration was signed by Jacques Chirac and then Prime Minister Tony Blair, it was this idea that Europe needed, its own autonomous defense capabilities backed by credible forces. And the US response to that was telling. Just weeks later, at one of the NATO ministerials attended by then Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, she came out with her famous 3D speech, that there should be no discrimination against NATO, no, I think, dilution of NATO's abilities, and no diminution of NATO. I think maybe that second word was wrong, but the 3Ds, that's basically been the US dogma for decades now, which means that we've always pushed back on Europe's efforts to take more of a responsibility for their own defense. But that's not really the world that we live in anymore. I think there's this idea that the Republican Party in the US has towed a pretty tough line on Europe, and that's definitely true. But I think that that's a trend that we should expect to develop on the side of the Democrats as well. This message that Europe needs to be more independent and take more responsibility for its own continental security. So in my mind, that means having support from the United States to do this, rather than stymieing European efforts based on what that might mean for the transatlantic relationship and what that might mean for US defense industry. In my mind, having more of a peer than a client makes for a better ally in the long run, and that's what I think Europe should be. I think it also means really institutionalizing some efforts that are already in practice on both sides of the Atlantic. So we have the US-EU defense and security dialogue that I believe has met twice during the Biden administration. I think that group should meet a couple of times a year and come up with a 10 or 15-year time frame for where Europe should be at certain, a 5-year, 10-year, 15-year mark. And in turn, it will support this European defense industrial strategy, which aims to lessen the dependence of Europe on foreign procured weapons. And then finally, this is more of a controversial point. In our piece that my colleague Michael and I wrote, we laid out a 25-year time frame for Europeanizing NATO, and that would fall in line with its 100-year anniversary. So sort of this new NATO for a new century. The Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, the head military commander of Europe, has always been an American, and it's clear why. The US has always been the strongest ally in NATO. It's been a foundational aspect of NATO. At some point down the line, if we are unable to at least rotate Europeans through that position, then I think that we have somehow failed somewhere along the line. If Europe still doesn't have the ability or the political will to lead NATO, not in the way that the United States has, but at least in a way that's as credible as a deterrent effect that the United States has been. We have a long way to go to get there. Clearly, we're not there yet. We're not at a point either where I think the US should be decreasing its forces on the European continent. However, if we're looking 25 years down the line, I think that's probably where we're headed. The US, prioritization has been a big term in foreign policy circles now, but for a very long time. And I see a scenario where the United States is going to have to double down in the Indo-Pacific region, and that's where a lot of our focus is going to have to be. And that might come at the expense of some presence on the European continent. So it's better to prepare for that now through many years of discussions and preparations, rather than, like a surprise move that leaves Europe scrambling because it doesn't have the capabilities. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Mathieu, we've heard about how countries' internal politics can affect NATO's operational capacity and its stance on certain issues. And one of the big news this summer have been elections in the UK and France, where the left has done well, in some cases unexpectedly so, due to a lot of rhetoric, I think, around right-wing surges in Europe. What do these elections show about the political state of Europe, and how might they affect the alliance?
Sure. Well, thank you first for having me. Since we're talking Olympics, I'm glad I made it to this great podium in All-Star company. And thank you for this question, because I think it's really important. We always see a lot of papers and publications on how we should Trump-proof NATO, how we should America-proof Europe, as if Europe is a cohesive bloc. And what we saw is a series of important elections that show that there are different trajectories even within Europe. Nothing is as consequential as the US elections that we will see in November because of the sheer size and importance of the US for NATO. But UK and France are probably behind the US, the most capable and important militaries in Europe. They're also the two other nuclear powers. So, of course, what happens in London and Paris is important for the rest of NATO. What we have seen is, paradoxically, at the same time, there's been kind of opposite trajectories between the UK and France. UK has turned inwards for a couple of years following Brexit, where they had to show the rest of first the British people and the rest that Brexit delivers. Now with the election of Labour, we're probably turning a page, and the motto of Keir Starmer's government is they want to reset relationship with the rest of Europe. And at the same time, probably at the same time as Brexit happened, Emmanuel Macron, France, stood up as kind of a leader of the multilateral liberal Europe, and following the European elections, he has suffered a major setback. And so France is now in a political turmoil where first the National Rally won a first round of legislative elections. Then the second round, there was a bloc to we call it cordon sanitaire, to prevent a victory from the National Rally, and the left-wing bloc won the most votes in the parliament. But we have no end in sight of the political complications that we have, because Macron has made clear that there is no winner, and so we have to make compromises and build coalitions, which is not very in the French nature. We're not Germans in that sense. But when it comes to the impact for NATO, actually, it's pretty minimal, in the sense that, in fact, London, sorry for the light, London, whoever has been in power, has been always ultra committed to NATO, and there is no, I mean, Keir Starmer has given clear signs that he will be equally committed to NATO, to support of Ukraine. And when it comes to France, in fact, whatever the outcome, Macron will still be the president until 2027. He has also given signs that he wants, while promoting European strategic autonomy, be committed to NATO. And whatever the coalition that comes up, so there is part of the left wing in France that is NATO skeptic, but this is definitely not the part of the left that will form a government in France. So basically, you should expect continuity. Just a final word to broaden the spectrum, because in fact we had European elections at the same time, which is basically the sum of 27 national elections. So it gives us a more global picture of Europe, and what we can say is that there is room for short-term optimism, but some concerns for the longer term, because what we have seen is basically, out of 27 elections, 20 were against the incumbent governments. And in fact, France and UK are not exceptions to that. And so what we see is basically anger at governments, very polarized societies. So not at the same level as the US maybe, but in fact, kind of similar patterns all across Europe. And so if you add up these, the NATO EU skeptics, the pro-NATO, pro-EU, in the end, you have a result that that the center holds, and that in the end the European Commission will be probably going in the same direction as the previous one. So there will be continuity, but really the picture is a bit more worrying if you look in more details at the national voting patterns. And one final word is that I think it's also encouraging for EU-NATO relations, which have always been complicated, but the fact that von der Leyen will continue at the Commission. The next High Representative, the Foreign Affairs Minister of Europe, is really pro-NATO, Kaja Kallas, and the next NATO SecGen as well is a strong committed European. So probably that bodes well to end up on a note of optimism for EU-NATO relations.
Thank you. And now we're shifting to, the elephant in the room. I think and we're getting a lot of questions in the Q&A box about this. So I'm glad we'll be able to address it. And of course, if you're listening and if you have any questions at any point, please do put them in the Q&A box. So the other elections, the US elections, Rachel. That is a big topic on a lot of people's minds, as we're seeing in the Q&A box. And I think it was something that really kind of hung over much of the recent summit. There will be a new administration in the White House in January. One of the candidates, Donald Trump, has had a somewhat combative stance on NATO, advocating for more participation from other members. He's also advocated for ending the war in Ukraine. How might either result of the election in November impact the alliance?
Gosh, yeah, that's a tough one. And you're right that it is the elephant in the room, and it's something that all of us are talking about consistently. And it was certainly hanging in the air at the NATO Summit last July, which, by the way, I mean, that's only a few weeks ago. So Biden was still the Democratic presidential candidate at the time. And since then, he's obviously dropped out of the race, replaced by Kamala Harris, and she has yet to choose a vice presidential running mate. That should happen by early next week. I think she'll have a rally in Pennsylvania next Tuesday with her vice presidential running mate. So I think there's a couple things here. The first is that Kamala Harris is not really a foreign policy person, but she has a great foreign policy advisor, Phil Gordon, who is a long-standing foreign policy hand in the U.S. government, and has, I think, offered her great advice in terms of how to deal with NATO, how to deal with Ukraine, how to deal with Europe. And so I think just in terms of her foreign policy, we should probably expect more continuity than not when it comes to Europe and Ukraine. You could see some differences on maybe Middle East policy. She kind of has to toe a really difficult line for the next 5 or 6 months, where she needs to make her own platform while at the same time not completely breaking with the foreign policy of Joe Biden, nor his foreign policy legacy. So that's a difficult role, I think, for her to play. And so if the Democrats win in November, I would expect more of the same in terms of U.S. support for Ukraine. Now, of course, there's nuances to that, but that I'll get to in a minute. Donald Trump and J.D. Vance are very different in terms of how they both think about the U.S. role in the world, how they think about alliances, how they think about NATO specifically, and how they think about Ukraine. Now, Donald Trump has said that he will not pull the United States out of NATO, and I think that that's right. However, I do also think that his rhetoric the last time around, although it didn't directly damage NATO, his policies, he did not put policies in place that were damaging towards the NATO alliance. But the rhetoric put a lot of fear in people's minds that the United States might not be there to stand by its commitments as a NATO ally. And that is enough, I think, to create weakness in the foundation, because NATO's deterrent effect rests on the shoulders primarily today of the United States. So the idea that, you know, the United States wouldn't come to the defense of NATO allies that don't meet their 2% spending targets, not requirements, by the way, targets, I think is enough to create some doubt. And I think that we should expect tough rhetoric if he and JD Vance are elected in November. JD Vance has sort of been this new emerging voice on both the limits of US military power abroad, but I think also the limits of the benefits that alliances provide for the United States. He has been you can go back and read his tweets, extremely harsh on Europe, you know, calling them freeloaders, and especially when it comes to Germany, talking about how all of Germany's security policies have turned into manure. I mean, he actually tweeted that. He says that, you know, Germany has lessened its defense and security in the name of a stupid green energy policy. Like, these are all things that you can go back and read. And so, you know, I don't think that we should expect the same sort of kumbaya, America is back message from the Republicans, nor do I think that that's really a message that Kamala Harris should send either if she gets elected. I don't really think that was the right way for Biden to go about that, but that's kind of a different question. Trump has also said that he will solve the Ukraine conflict in one day, which is, you know, a bold pronouncement for someone that I don't think really understands the like identitarian and like imperialist impulses of Vladimir Putin and the Russian regime, and the historical wrongs that Putin believes he is righting. And I mean, this goes so much deeper than just like Donald Trump showing up one day and bringing two sides to the table and coming up with a ceasefire line and saying, hold it here. This is just an intractable conflict. And so I worry that if he's elected, Ukraine is going to get a bad deal. And Putin or Trump will use that as a foreign policy win very early on. You know, there's been some sense that like Orban could be seen maybe as a go-between here. And I don't actually think that's right. I think that Trump would want to deal directly with Vladimir Putin. He loves strong men. He loves deals. He loves coming to the table and getting things done. And unfortunately, like, I do think that Ukraine would be on the receiving end of kind of a crappy deal, if I'm being honest. But the problem too is that this issue has really been, the issue of Ukraine and NATO has really been polarized in the United States. It has turned into a partisan football. And the Democrats are now sort of seen as the saviors of the transatlantic alliance, the saviors of Ukraine, and the Republicans are sort of seen as the death knell, the potential death knell of it. And that's, I think, a dangerous dynamic that we've gotten into that I would like to see us try to avoid going forward. But no matter what happens in the White House, passing aid for Ukraine comes down to decisions on Capitol Hill. And although the Biden administration was able to get this $60 billion latest tranche of aid passed, I think it's 212 Republicans still voted against it. That is not a small number. That is a very clear partisan line that has been drawn on Capitol Hill. And so I do worry that no matter who comes into the office in November, no matter how pro or anti-NATO or Ukraine they might be, the answers to our policies, the sort of guiding aspect of U.S. foreign policy really comes to the decisions that we're able to make on Capitol Hill. And I really worry that there's going to be a lot of tension up there and potentially like really not able to move forward or especially provide more support for Ukraine.
Thank you. Kind of sticking with that theme, Jamie, turning to you, this idea that Trump may be less committed to NATO than Biden. I think that's a pretty clear statement. How is NATO preparing for a potential Trump victory? What does the possibility of a second Trump term and possible loss of support for Ukraine impact? How does it impact the alliance's outlook on its own future? What they might be doing to sort of future-proof that scenario, as well as on prospects for a peace deal in Ukraine? And take what you will there.
Well, Rachel said a lot already. I was still at NATO during the 4 years of Trump's, dare I say, first, let's see, only so far, occupancy of the White House. So I draw some sort of lessons from that experience. I mean, I think the first thing is NATO has to deal with whoever is in the White House. We've had these burden-sharing debates throughout the whole history of the alliance. Trump may use strong rhetoric, but JFK, many presidents over the years, Obama, have made, maybe in slightly more diplomatic language, the same sort of points, which also point towards what Rachel was saying earlier about the need for the Europeans to step up. And I completely agree with that. But of course, the United States is fundamental to NATO. So if Trump's in the White House, as Mark Rutte has pointed out, let's stop, moaning about it. We have to deal with it. Now, how do we deal with it? Well, of course, first of all, a lot's going to depend upon Congress. Rachel is right. Will internationalist Republicans still be around in the House and the Senate? Will the Democrats hold on to the Senate? Will they, be able to regain control of the House? What would that political landscape look like? Because you remember in Trump's first term, notwithstanding the rhetoric, there was still lots of the Mitch McConnells around in the Congress who were willing to pass Senate resolutions, making it difficult, if not impossible, we'll see, for the president to withdraw from NATO. It's good to hear from Rachel that that's not what Trump is planning to do. So that's the first thing. The second thing, adults in the room. You remember the first time round, Trump was sort of balanced by people, generals, McMaster and others, seasoned diplomats who did, understand the realities of the world. I think NATO has to be grateful to John Bolton if he's telling the truth in his memoirs, that he was the one in a sort of a short car ride between Trump's residence in Brussels and NATO headquarters back in 2018, who persuaded Trump not to withdraw from NATO. So obviously a key thing, who's going to be Secretary of State, who's going to be Secretary of Defense, National Security Advisor, people that NATO can work with to get the message across. But my main point, Courtney, from my previous sort of observer position inside NATO, is Trump is very inconsistent. He does change his mind. He often gives very mixed messages, and he's done so on Ukraine and peace in the last couple of days. He's had quite a good phone call with Zelensky, at least if the Ukrainian side is to be believed. He does change his mind, and he is persuadable. I mean, my old boss Jens Stoltenberg showed that by sticking at it, lots and lots of trips to Washington, lots of meetings with Trump. Over time, you could actually persuade Trump to see, the 2% spending target as a good news story for him. If you'd said to President Trump, you're weakening NATO, he would say, you must be joking. I saved NATO because it was my pressure that got the Europeans to take their responsibilities seriously and turned it into a more effective alliance. And he can take some credit for that. Don't forget, it was the Trump administration that gave the first lethal weapons to Ukraine after 2014, the Javelins and others, which the Obama administration had not granted them. And under Trump, despite the rhetoric, NATO exercises went on. The Americans dug concrete in Poland and elsewhere in Central and Eastern Europe to build up their stocks and build up their infrastructure. So no, I'm not going to pretend for 1 minute that it won't be a rough ride and occasionally unpleasant. What worries me the most is that Trump clearly doesn't like sort of things like NATO meetings. I was there at 2018 watching him, where he came into the room late, gave his speech, got up, walked out, and was never seen again. Clearly this bores him. He's not engaged in the particular issues and discussions. And I doubt if that situation would be different next time round. But there are a couple of big things. First of all, if Russia, despite a Trump victory, continues to play havoc inside the United States, aggressive espionage, interfering in elections, disinformation campaigns, this sort of stuff, not easy to overlook that. Secondly, if Russia overtly sides with China, so that it's impossible for Trump to deal with China without also dealing with Russia, not so easy for him to separate the two and think that he can have good relations with Putin, bad relations with Xi. And if Trump can be persuaded to remain engaged in NATO, one piece of good news for the Europeans is he's going to spend a fantastic amount of money on defense. He's going to modernize the American nuclear arsenal. He said about that last time. The defense budget will go up presumably over $1 trillion a year. The US military will get a lot of new weapons. He likes that kind of thing. And to the extent that there is a very strong militarily capable United States, if it remains committed to NATO, that could be a good thing. So first of all, no alarmism. Trump can be persuaded. He does change his mind. But Europeans, of course, have got to be ready with good arguments and to engage. My final piece of advice to Europeans is stop talking about Trump proofing. Trump hears this, he hears what people are saying about Trump proofing. This is not very wise to talk about it in this term. Talk about it as Rachel has done in terms of beefing up the European role and responsibility in the alliance, because that can not only help to keep the Americans engaged, it's also the only insurance policy if the Americans are less engaged. So please, no more Trump proofing. That term is banned henceforth.
All right. If we have one takeaway, we will make sure we will not use the term Trump proofing. Mathieu, I'd like to circle back to Jamie's first answer and those last two pieces of the takeaways from the summit, which is largely focused on Asia. And so the connection between NATO and its democratic partners in Asia, as well as the language of decisive enabler to discuss China and its role in Russia's war in Ukraine. So you've written in Foreign Affairs that NATO is not the right vehicle through which to engage with Asian counterparts to address China. Could you elaborate on why that is, why you think NATO is taking this approach, and sort of what else you think is germane to this, and particularly given the elections?
Yes, absolutely. And it's a very important issue. So China made its way to NATO language in 2019 at the London Summit. It was the first time that China was mentioned as an issue for NATO. And this has been increasingly so since then, especially in 2022. We have changed eras, of course, with the war in Ukraine. And you might remember that it was preceded a few weeks before by the so-called Xi-Putin joint statement, of no limits partnership, which really was a watershed moment, especially for many Europeans who tended to be, let's say, lenient with China's foreign policy. It really changed their minds about China and the connection that it has with Russia. And so we've seen this continuing, and what the summit in Washington said, the declaration, as mentioned by Jamie, is that China is now considered a decisive enabler of Russia's war efforts. And I think it's a fairly accurate depiction of what China does. The declaration also calls out the dual-use equipment that China provides to Russia, and this is absolutely significant for Russia's ability to sustain its war efforts despite the sanctions. So we see more and more converging outlook among Europeans and Americans in that. The China agenda within NATO has been mostly pushed by the US because it considers China as its pacing challenge, and it has been supported also by Jens Stoltenberg, who wanted to turn NATO into a global NATO that deals with all the issues. And this alignment goes both ways, actually, because if you look at the language, for instance, systemic challenge, which is the way China is described by NATO, it's actually how Europeans started to call China. And also this term of de-risking now that is used by both sides of the Atlantic, it actually comes from Europe first. So we see more and more alignment on these issues. Nevertheless, there are still some differences on the way on two things. First is the threat perception. Of course, the threat is much more acute for the US, for instance, than it is for many Europeans. Actually, some Europeans don't consider NATO as a threat at all. If you look at Hungary, for instance, has very close ties with Beijing. Turkey wants to maintain also close relations with China. Germany has a lot of trade with China, and so on and so forth. And second, and perhaps more interesting and problematic maybe, is the role of NATO in tackling the challenge. So what has been agreed upon is that most of Chinese challenges to European security for the moment are still non-military, and NATO's role is to deal with its own area of responsibility, which is the Euro-Atlantic. So let's deal with what the challenges that China poses for the Euro-Atlantic. So this is all agreed. What is more, let's say, controversial, and this is the object of the piece we wrote for Foreign Affairs, is what NATO could or should do when engaging in the Indo-Pacific or with the Indo-Pacific, which is, of course, far from its remit. We have seen, and Jamie alluded to that, and it's clear that theaters are more and more interconnected. Also, Japan, Australia, South Korea are helping Ukraine in its fight against Russia. So we see more and more solidarities, which is, of course, very good. And I think it's very helpful that we cooperate more with these partners in any framework possible, be it NATO. So there are tailored partnerships with these countries. What is more problematic, in my view, is the strategic signaling that we send to China, which is not, I mean, the strategic signaling towards China is not too much our problem, but the Indo-Pacific is a very vast region. And these four partners are only Pacific, not Indo. And their population combined is the population of Indonesia, more or less. And the fact is that across the Indo-Pacific, you have a very vast degrees of understanding of strategic affairs and NATO's role. And in fact, it's one thing for a Malaysian or for an Indonesian to see NATO doing some cybersecurity cooperation with South Korea or Japan. This is good. But it's something else to see four leaders invited by NATO saying all together, we will tackle strategic challenges on both theaters, having Stoltenberg saying we'll be more and more interoperable to tackle China together. NATO means something. It's a Cold War, it's a military institution. And so for many people in the Indo-Pacific, seeing NATO more and more engaged is a source of concern. I've written this piece with an Indian scholar, so reflecting the views in India. India, the very same week, Narendra Modi was giving a hug to Vladimir Putin. This is not NATO's fault, but it shows that within the ASEAN, the very same week said they want to join the BRICS. This is not NATO's fault, but this tells the variety, the diversity of views. And in fact, the Indian Ocean, India, ASEAN, are fundamental for Europe, for the EU, in terms of trade, even in terms of security to the Indian Ocean. So we want to make sure that we don't embarrass, if not alienate, some of these people if we go too far in not cooperating at a lower level. This is very good, we should go for it. But in the strategic messaging, be more careful about the intentions of NATO.
Thank you. Jamie, so one question we have here is, the questioner writes, it appears we are seeing a shift within the alliance, one in which the member countries in the East, particularly Poland, are calling for greater and more urgent military buildup to counter the threat from Russia. How is this being received by other NATO members?
Yes, a great question. I don't know who asked it, but excellent question. There was a bit of a split, sort of culturally, psychologically between Eastern Europe, which everybody in the audience will understand, very much from historical reasons, occupation by Russia, the Tsars, the Soviets, and so on, the proximity of what they consider to be the Russian threat, their willingness, therefore, like Poland, to spend 4%, and according to the Polish Defense Minister Koski, even 5% of their GDP on defense. Also increases in the Baltic states, conscription being reintroduced. This called what the French, Mathieu, if he will forgive me, would call esprit de défense, building air raid shelters, civil, protection, really the whole kit and caboodle. And, countries back in Western Europe have a much lower threat perception, much more laid back, like Spain, and Italy struggling, to get close to the 2% margin. And of course, Germany, also always the pivotal state in the middle. What you've seen now, I think, in the last couple of years is been also a sort of a sense that, in Western Europe too, that they need to take defence more seriously. A number of Western generals, not only in my own country, the UK, have openly sort of evoked the perspective of a war with Russia in 2 to 5 years. You see more of these Western European countries now moving up towards the 2%. The Netherlands, for example, which was also a difficult country just a couple of weeks back, and the rest, the Norwegians announced quite a major investment a couple of weeks ago. Mathieu mentioned the UK, the Labour government, which is committed to 2.5% of GDP. So I think this sort of gap, if you like, between Western Europe and Eastern Europe will remain. I mean, the problem in Western Europe, of course, is economic circumstances still tend to be key. Germany, for example, having started out with the Zeitwende, you remember the speech of Chancellor Scholz, with the idea of reaching 2% of GDP, spending 100 billion on modernizing the Bundeswehr. They talked the talk. They got off to a very brave start. But last week, they announced they were cutting aid to Ukraine next year by 6 billion euros because of budget considerations. So I think there's still going to be this issue, hence the need for NATO and the EU to sort of find solutions that knit Eastern Europe and Western Europe closer together. For example, the British Defence Secretary was in Berlin last week, signing a defence agreement with Germany. The Brits and the French are now talking together again. The Poles and the Germans with the new government in Poland are starting to talk a lot more about land defence and so on, getting the Finns involved. So to gradually forming these kind of multinational coalitions between Western Europe and Eastern Europe, whether it be, to build Leopard 2 tanks or to upgrade aircraft or to repair equipment or to do training, as well as build, collective formations. And I think in the long run, this will help. But certainly when it comes to, resilience and civil protection, I think the Eastern Europeans have a lot to teach their Western European neighbours.
Great, thank you. Mathieu, we have a question here. They write, how do you envision the balance between NATO's conventional collective defense commitments and its growing focus on emerging security challenges such as cyber threats and climate change? Again, and this evolving in the face of sort of this uncertain political future.
Well, yes, this is an evergreen question in NATO. How do we tackle more of these? So what we've seen with Russia, especially before the launch of the war in Ukraine, is that these distinctions have been blurred in the sense that Russia has used a lot of what we call hybrid threats. And so I think there is more and more awareness within NATO on these issues. There have been center of excellences that have been put in place. This is taken into account in the language. There are new committees that are put in place also to tackle resilience. The only issue, and that's a common talking point in Paris, is that Rachel mentions the risk of duplications earlier between what the EU does and what NATO does. In fact, EU is very well equipped when it comes to non-military threats, on hybrid threats, and building resilience agenda across Europeans. So we want to make sure that there is, I'm not a big fan of the duplication either way, but that we make the most of useful redundancies between the EU and NATO. And there is some progress. There is a joint task force that has been put in place between the EU and NATO on resilience. And this is probably the way forward, more coordination between the two organizations. But these are very hard topics to grasp because they are all encompassing, and some countries really want their national decision making to remain the primary source of decision. So yes, work in progress.
Yes, always some tension there. Rachel, turning to you, we have a question actually from the same question. I'm going to try to combine a little bit of these two questions, and Jamie and Mathieu, please feel free to chime in if you'd like, because it's a big question. Do you foresee any time in the future when NATO may no longer be needed as it seems to be needed now? And if so, what global developments might need to take place? Or is it destined to grow as a military alliance in the years to come? And sort of as an addendum to that is, why does Ukraine need to be in NATO? And does it enhance global peace or diminish it?
This is such a difficult question. Look, I don't see a situation. Oh, I'm just going to write this down. I don't see a situation anytime soon where NATO is not necessary, because what that would mean is that there are no threats to freedom, to democracy, which are things that NATO protects. It would mean that Article 5, the Mutual Defense Clause, is no longer necessary. And in fact, threats to NATO and to NATO countries are becoming more esoteric. They're becoming more difficult to deal with. Things like cyber, things like artificial intelligence, the threat of climate change and what that means to military installations around the world, although there are probably other organizations that are better equipped to deal with that than NATO. Russia, I mean, Russia would have to be a completely different country for NATO not to be necessary. And so I think that even if we did find ourselves living in this sort of like utopian world where everyone got along, which is not going to happen, there are still areas where NATO must cooperate on the things that I've already mentioned. So I think that having 32 allies that are protecting not just the European continent, but protecting the values that all of us espouse is the underpinning purpose of NATO. It is security, it is a military alliance, it is deterrence, but I'm one of the people that believe it's also more than that. And though there are more things that we are working together to defend. The Ukraine question is a little bit more difficult for me. If any of you watching this webinar haven't yet seen the documentary 20 Days in Mariupol, I would implore you to go watch it, to give you a sense of what the Ukrainians are dealing with on a daily basis. It's absolutely harrowing. And I think we find ourselves sometimes in these conversations having geopolitical discussions that sort of forget that humans are at the center of this, and that the longer that this war goes on, more people will die. And so when you hear from people that now is not the time to talk about a negotiated settlement, we're not at a time where we should start having that discussion because the Ukrainians still want to fight, we should still supply them with weapons. There's a lot of that I agree with, but there's also a part of me that understands that just means that more Ukrainians will die at the end of the day. So I'm more prone to wanting to have those discussions and have more of a strategic dialogue about what that might mean for Ukraine. And I do think that if there was a discussion about recognizing the fact that some territory has been lost and the remaining part of that territory can only be protected by membership in NATO, I think that's a worthwhile discussion. And I think that the underlying logic that underpins it is largely correct. What I worry about, and this is not my opinion on whether or not Ukraine should join NATO, what I worry about is that in order for NATO to get there, where 32 allies could agree on letting it in, we're looking at a long road here. This is not something that's going to happen anytime soon. And I worry that even if we did get there, the carve-outs that we would have to make for certain countries to come to the table on it, in terms of what that meant for Article 5, maybe Hungary would want to say that they don't want to send troops. Maybe the US would say, well, this is going to be like any response would be primarily done by the Europeans, that it would weaken the Article 5 commitments that come along with it. So what I want to make sure of is that if and when Ukraine is a member of NATO, we are ready to defend it and fight for it in the exact same way that we would be ready and willing to fight for the Baltics, Poland, Germany, France, and I don't know that we are there yet. I'd be interested in Jamie and Matthew's views on this, but that's just what I worry about when it comes to having discussions about Ukraine's future in the alliance.
Jamie or Mathieu, want to weigh in on our final minute here?
Just only a minute, so that means I have 30 seconds and Matthew 30, which means I'm already at 25. I think that, you know, NATO carrying on, Rachel gave some very good arguments. NATO has changed four things. America is engaged in Europe, and that keeps Europe secure. Defense, always the bugaboo of the nation state in Europe. Think of the 19th century, 20th century. Defense is now a collective enterprise managed collectively. Number three, small and medium-sized countries have a seat at the table and a voice, are no longer the victims of history. And number four, as Rachel said, security threats are changing all the time. So you need some kind of structure which allows you to come around the table quickly, like cyberspace. Say, hey, new kid on the block, AI, how the heck are we going to deal with this? What's our policy? How do we manage this together? To my mind, none of those four things that really make NATO unique have changed or are likely to change in the future, and therefore NATO has to remain in existence. As I'm not going to be around in the 24th century, you know, all we can do as mortal human beings is try to at least manage the present, because that is the only hope that the future won't be far worse. On Ukraine, I simply think that, you know, having a very war-hardened Ukrainian military force defending you on your eastern flank, if Russia unfortunately is going to remain a hostile power for some time to come, is the best strategic interest of the NATO member states. But I don't underestimate the practical difficulties, and unless Ukraine survives as a functioning state from the present war, NATO membership, EU membership, the bets are off. It makes absolutely no sense. So again, you know, before we can have good options in the future, we have to take care of the present first, or all of the options will be bad.
Thank you. I think we've passed time now. Mathieu, we'll have to have you back and we can discuss this question further. Rachel, Jamie, Mathieu, thank you so much. This was a wonderfully informative discussion. Thank you for the great questions, everybody. We do have a few briefings coming up, including one next week that's looking at the geopolitics of the Olympics. That's on August 8th. So you can take a break from cheering for whichever team you're on to, you know, really learn about some of the geopolitics of it. And we do have a briefing about the post-Afghanistan withdrawal 3rd-year anniversary. So we will be speaking with Carter Malkasian and Masuda Sultan. And last but not least, we are a nonprofit. And so if you can, we encourage everyone to donate to keep these briefings free and open. So thank you. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Jamie. Thank you, Mathieu. Have a wonderful day, everybody. Really appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.